Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SITREP. SITREP is an notorious open source intelligence app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SITREP, for sponsoring this episode. Welcome to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias.
And I'm Shane, the Chief Technology Officer of Artorias.
And I'm Christian, the CEO of Artorias.
And in today's episode, we're going to cover the latest developments that occurred impacting the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, and even Eastern Europe. So for our listeners to kind of get a quick summary of what happened over the weekend, we saw President Trump had conversations at the sidelines of the UN General Assembly with President Zelensky, and subsequent reporting indicated that President Trump is considering giving Zelensky Tomahawk cruise missiles for them to conduct strikes into Russia. Although the decision has not been final, the reporting indicates that Trump was susceptible to this request. In addition, the United States Special Envoy for Ukraine, General Kellogg, indicated that President Trump has given full authority for Ukraine to conduct strikes deep inside of Russia, likely involving U.S.-provided weaponry, to include ATACMS. Although some of those strikes might require further approval from the Pentagon, it does indicate that President Trump is taking a much more significant, harder stance on Russia. Lastly, a key development that also happened over the weekend impacts the country of Moldova, where Russia did a lot of election interference during the Moldovan parliamentary elections, but failed to change the results, in which a landslide victory was declared by the pro-European Union political party of Moldova, led by Prime Minister Sandu. I guess the summary I would say is that this weekend probably was not a lot of good news for Russia, and we're getting more reporting that Russia continues to suffer a significant domestic fuel crisis. But the rhetoric from the United States, not only from President Trump, but even Vice President J.D. Vance, who historically has been a little bit more skeptical of Ukraine, indicates a harder stance, and now the United States is squarely putting the blame on President Putin for the failures to achieve a ceasefire or peace treaty, and that the United States is taking a harder stance. And over the weekend, we saw probably a noteworthy deployment of up to 8, if not more, U.S. Air Force refueler tankers heading over to Europe, indicating that there might be a possibility of subsequent U.S. military deployment into Europe. This is in response to Russia, or suspected Russia, drone incursions impacting various European civilian airports from Denmark, Norway, Poland, and other drone incursions in Romania and in the Baltics. In Denmark specifically, we saw a lot of airports having to shut down. The suspicion and the reporting that we're getting is that these are small quadcopters that are possibly launched via maritime vessels along the sea and being flown over civilian airports to disrupt air travel. So the deployment of these air refueling tankers might indicate a harder stance of a U.S. military posture, possibly for deterrence operation. With that, Christian, I'd love to go to you with that summary. We are seeing President Trump might be taking a much more harder stance against President Putin.
Thank God. The only words I will say in regards to that. It's been a very long time coming to see the full circle, all of the stages of grief that the Trump administration has gone through in order to come to the conclusion that, you know what, the left is actually right about this. And here we are. So I've said it since even before Trump was inaugurated. I would sit on these podcasts and spaces, and I would discuss my theory of mass retribution against the Russian state from the Trump administration once they came to a formidable conclusion that Russia is indeed the aggressor and has no off-ramp. Here we are. We're now in phase 3 of this. Phase 1 was Trump being pro-Ukraine. Phase 2 was bringing everybody to a table and realizing Russia's the failing party. Stage 3 is where we're at now, which is, all right, now we have to ramp up our support for Ukraine. Stage 4 is realizing that, yeah, though Russia is basically a failed military state at this point, it is still a large conventional fighting force that can pull up a fight and still beat out Ukraine with a war of attrition. and especially a war of hybrid warfare against Europe. So I think stages 3 and 4 are happening faster than I think I initially anticipated, and people that I've spoken to about this theory that subscribe to it also anticipated. Um, I think stage 2 of realizing Russia was the actual aggressor and not this shining star that Trump put on Putin before he got into office took a little bit longer than anticipated as well. But I think the longevity of that, of taking so much time, has just fueled the rage that will happen for phase 3 and phase 4 of this theory. Um, just this morning, Russia announced that they're going to increase conscription by over 150,000 troops by end of year. Um, as you mentioned, Stefano, the constant bombardment of airspace within Eastern Europe is only rising by the day. Just this morning, Romania found another drone off their coast that had been washed ashore. Um, Again, this stuff has been happening over the entire course of the war, but it's always been one-off incidents. One drone uh, will lose connection here, or even a Ukrainian air defense missile heading into Poland, or whatever the story is. Like, it was always kind of one-off, easy to apologize to the public and move on events, and we are past that at this point. I mean, we're talking about mass drone incursions that shut down major logistics hubs for all of these countries. Like, just from an economic standpoint alone, this stuff is starting to affect NATO and the EU as a whole. And it's costing them a lot. I just read something at the Atlantic Council yesterday in regards to this hybrid warfare from Russia, as well as the lack of NATO or EU response, is only going to fuel Russia to continue doing it, because it costs NATO and the EU so much resources to kind of fly around all these fighter jets and close major logistics hubs and set up 80 air defense systems across the entire eastern flank, as opposed to just bombing the drone facility or doing search raids on every ship that goes within the mutual economic zones of these countries and the seas, or even just doing it in international waters. And like, from my standpoint of it, there is enough support, in my opinion, to do like a quick bid to the UN General Assembly or even the Security Council, as a minority partner, to be able to drum up some international support for them to start raiding these vessels. But there hasn't been any sort of diplomatic rush to do any of that. I'm not exactly sure the reasoning why. It's probably the same reason why every time Article 4 is called, which has happened, correct me if I'm wrong, 3 times since this war has started at this point, or is it 2?
If memory serves me correctly, there was one, I believe, in the Eastern European countries called it shortly after the invasion, and then we saw Poland and I believe Lithuania again, or Estonia activated. So I think it's 3 now since this war. But
somebody will comment on the right amount. But the truth stands. Like, we're seeing an increase of the sit around wait mantra. From the European side of the house, which was also kind of the Biden side of the house as well, which is kind of that like Cold War-esque, like, we're past it now, the Berlin Wall fell, let's try to see if the Russians are actually as crazy as we assume they are. But as I've always kind of alluded to with the Trump side of the house, is that deterrence is fought with deterrence. I mean, that's the same thing with what we're seeing with even domestic U.S. policy issues, which I'm not going to jump into, but even changing the name of the Department of Defense to a prettier name of Department of War, it shows this quote unquote, the Trump administration coins it, peace through strength. And peace through strength in Europe is actually doing something, though, which is not what we're seeing. I'd love to highlight and jump into a deeper discussion with you guys on the overflights we saw of KC-135s and other refueling aircrafts from pretty much every airfield in the U.S. that houses them to mainland Europe over the course of the last, I would say, 12 to 15 hours.
Yeah, no, so I think that's an important aspect. And, Shane, you and I were kind of discussing this before we started recording, and kind of Again, we really don't have any official confirmation. There's a multitude of explanations that can be done about this. It could be an end admission, rotation of forces. But to me personally, this does indicate that I think the U.S. European Command is concerned about these Russian aggressions and challenging NATO airspace, and in a way, it's for those who've been in the military, this is kind of a change, a moving up on different phases of operations within a declared named operation, right? Where this isn't steady state operation. We're going into the deterrence phase, at least in some component, right, within it. Maybe this is a concern that U.S. Air Force Europe has, realizing that now there's a significantly much more NATO air policing missions along the Baltics, requiring these American aerial refuel tankers to provide the support. Because let's be absolutely realistic here, although NATO and European countries do have air refueling capabilities, it's not substantial and it's not nearly enough what the U.S. Air Force has. And to me, I think this is where it is, where it does indicate that the reporting we got at the end of August, where the United States was going to change their reduce the forces, reduce the presence in Europe. I think this deployment indicates that that's not the case, and even the signing of the National Defense Strategy, which indicates Homeland Defense and Homeland Security as a primary national security threat. This is just a reminder that when crisis hits around the world, the U.S. military quickly deploys. But Shane, I would love to see your take. This, to me, again, just sounds like the U.S. Air Force and U.S. European Command is concerned about Russia's aggression, and they're deploying assets to enable NATO to continuously operate along the Eastern European front.
Yeah, of course. I mean, like you kind of hinted to earlier, we were discussing this before the call or before the podcast. And, one of the things that comes into my mind when you're talking is, why is this going on and what's the thought process behind this? If this is in fact movement of forces for, let's say like some op word that, is kind of a standing order, right? For if something does happen. One thing I'd like to highlight is USARAF's commander, General Donahue. I was a senior OSINT analyst at 18th Airborne Corps before he PCS and took command over there. He is all about Ukraine and understanding what's going on. He has a very forward thought process in regards to what the U.S. has to do to maintain an operational advantage. So, it would not shock me at all if this is a positioning of forces to enable future operations if something was to go sideways.
And I think that's the key aspect, right, that we're trying to analyze. And again, it's interesting, though. This is kind of tactical level analysis with operational level analysis and strategic level analysis. But I think the general theme we're seeing now is this hardening stance of U.S. military, at least posture towards Russia. I think we cannot discount one. The United States Special Envoy for Ukraine, the White House Special Envoy for Ukraine, General Kellogg, said on Fox News, Trump has given green light for Ukraine to conduct strikes into Russia. And he kind of gave a slight criticism to the Department of War, Department of Defense. The way he's saying is like, if the president gave this authorization, hey, Pentagon, and I think this is kind of a dig at maybe certain elements within the DoD, saying you cannot undermine the president's authority, right? He gave these broad-based authorities, enable Ukraine to conduct these strikes. And we've seen Ukraine continue to expand their strikes in Russia, specifically related to their, oil and gas infrastructure. And then the possibility of the United States giving Tomahawk cruise missiles that even J.D. Vance acknowledged in another interview in Fox News, saying, look, ultimately it's up to the decision of the president. But that deployment or that authorization of that military equipment is very significant, and Zelensky clearly has intended use for it. Shane, I think that these indicate a kind of significant hardening of U.S. posture towards Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was actually just going to bring up the Tomahawk discussions right before you mentioned it. We can't, we can't look at this without taking, every single aspect into account. Discussions are one thing, right? But once you start seeing weapon systems associated with the discussion as well, You're looking at, Tomahawks versus, HIMARS that Ukraine currently has. You're looking at what, 10 times the range? Roughly, Tomahawks roughly what, 1,600 kilometer range, something along those lines. Those strikes are a lot deeper than what you'd be seeing going on right now, even with HIMARS for the authorized quote unquote deeper strikes that the U.S. did in the past against Russian targets.
Yeah, and even I think President Zelensky in an interview said, "Hey, we'll use this against the Kremlin," right? I mean, obviously, just kind of to highlight the threat, but I think that's kind of a significant problem for the Russians. The introduction of Tomahawk cruise missiles would vastly expand any strike capability that the Ukrainians have. Not even the Europeans have these kind of capabilities. The Tomahawk is, one of the deepest strike capabilities that the United States possesses, and having those in Ukrainian hands would have a significant impact inside of Russia. And so, those are very kind of key developments. Another thing that we're getting this morning as of this recording, that I think is also important to highlight, is that, we're even seeing the Europeans providing additional support. We just got a report that the Ukraine's deputy defense minister says that additional deliveries of F-16 aircraft, as well as French Mirage and Swedish Gripen, are expected. This was during an interview with BBC. The BBC reporter asked, "Can you say when and how many?" And the deputy defense minister just said, "When you see them in the sky over Ukraine, then you'll know." So we've seen the F-16s provide a critical role. Additional F-16s are going in there. Now we're getting French Mirage and Swedish Gripen aircrafts. I mean, this is a significant capability, and it's kind of a very interesting dynamic where even we've seen the Ukrainian military really, we've highlighted a lot the Russian ballistic missile, cruise missiles, and drones. And I don't think we've necessarily had enough conversation also from the Ukrainian perspective, right? And the significant advancement, even in their own domestically produced capabilities to conduct strikes and weaponry from drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. We've seen the famous Flamingo cruise missile, the Neptune cruise missile, which was responsible for sinking the Moskva, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. Now we're seeing these capabilities, even a possibility of a Tomahawk. We've seen the Ukrainian special forces conduct deep strike and operations in Russia, their intelligence agencies as well. I mean, this is one of those situations that, yes, the Russian military has been crippled and they still have very low, robust capabilities to conduct strikes. But I think a similar argument needs to be made about Ukraine. I mean, we've seen, I think if we analyze the Ukrainian military in 2014, when the seizure of Crimea and the decrepit state that has been, even during constant war in Ukraine since the occupation of Crimea and the first invasion of the Donbass, we've seen a completely different Ukrainian military now capable of conducting persistent strikes inside of Russia and able to hold off the Russian military. So, Kristen, I mean, is this one of the situations where people love to highlight the kind of the remaining strengths of the Russian military, but not as much attention is really giving at Ukraine and their abilities not only to kind of hold the line, even with all the problems they have in some of the territories, they've lost. But we're seeing a quantitative advancement in Ukrainians' military arsenal. And these latest news indicate that more is to come.
Yeah, I mean, we just saw even over the past night, like deep strikes at electrical facilities within Russia, like causing blackouts across the board. Like, and we're not talking like things that are right up against the border. I mean, we're talking like at least 150 kilometers into Russian territory, and you have to think that Russia still controls. I mean, a couple hundred miles deep into Ukraine, a few hundred miles in certain places, like in terms of the front lines. So these are deep strikes, all things considered, and these are just based on Ukrainian merit and merit alone. I mean, we're seeing. I mean, we've even seen it before the start of the war. I don't think people like. I don't think the three of us. I mean, we all discussed well before this war ever started on a few topics regarding the Ukrainian armed forces, and we never anticipated them to be this good. I mean, they've proven themselves time and time again. Like, if there's any selling point even to the Trump administration that Ukraine should win this war, it's just due to the fact that we want the Ukrainians as an ally if there ever is a larger war, because they have the levels of ingenuity that are just unseen in the modern era. I mean, they are effectively the best fighting force that the world has seen since World War II. From a country perspective, if you will. They win battles, they retake shit, and they're pushing a larger adversarial way constantly. I don't think the strikes are going to decrease. I think as Russia kind of change, I mean, excuse me, as the Trump administration changes their stance on Russia, I think those strikes will become even more prevalent. I think there will be a point uh, where Trump basically is like gloves off and Ukraine can do whatever they want. I do know for a fact when I was working um, under the Ukrainian government for a while that there was a lot of discussion on what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. There were missions that the Ukrainians, even from an intel perspective, built themselves, but the United States promptly shut down. So I do know that there is appetite across the Ukrainian armed forces for deeper strikes into Russia. Even from a societal standpoint, they're definitely down for it. Um, and to deter Russia more to from just a strategic perspective alone and being able to just show Russia that, hey, like no matter where you are in this country, you are not safe. Um, but if you tie it from a strategic, again, I get lost on like tactical level analysis. That's all Stefano. But from like a strategic level perspective, I don't think it's a good thing per se in terms of like escalation and how we pursue further. I think this only gives more buying power to Putin to tell his citizens of, hey, like this is a war on our nation, et cetera, et cetera. Because you have to remember that the information vacuum that the Russians receive is obviously very polarized towards being very positive for Russia's stance on this war. So if they're being sold this propaganda and they might not believe it, and those people on the fence then start seeing Ukrainian drones fly into their facilities, they're going to start raising their hands and be like, okay, I don't mind if my son goes and fights. And that's kind of the scare that I have personally, especially as the recruiting numbers for Russia expand, is that the more that these Ukrainian strikes have this level of lethality to them, the more this war feels real for Russia and the more they're willing to fight it. I mean, that's just case in point. I mean, Russia's been in conflicts for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, this is not a country of peace per se. They've always fought for something, whether it was an internal issue or an external issue. I don't think that that's going to phase away because the U.S. is now getting involved in assisting Ukraine with deeper strikes, with munitions and so forth. I think it only embroils the Russian population more and causes a more fearful attitude towards NATO and Ukraine, which obviously puts us in a more strategically bad situation in the whole grand scheme of the war.
You know, one of the interesting aspects, though, and I saw this from the Steve Rosenberg, the BBC reporter based on Moscow, that was pretty interesting is we are seeing Russian media press at least highlight the two issues now. One, how long this war is going to last for the Russian society and try to bake that in. They're already talking about, there's going to be years and a war of attrition, and that's kind of the rhetoric that they're doing. But more importantly, it's the fuel crisis. And it's interesting how they framed it was how Steve Rosenberg in his morning report, he said when he was reading kind of Russian newspapers, he said ever since Trump highlighted the fuel crisis inside of Russia, it's been very hard for the Russians to hide that. And now they're talking about it. Now, obviously, the Russians love to frame it differently. They rarely acknowledge that the reason why there's a fuel crisis, a lot of it is due because of significant success in Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil refineries and gas refineries. The famous term is, well, the oil refinery caught fire because debris fell from the sky, right? Okay, take that for what it's worth. But I think there is sort of that concern within the Russian, let's say, elite within the Kremlin of this fuel crisis, because we are seeing fuel lines. We're seeing that this is causing an economic impact, which President Trump has highlighted in his Truth Social, which was kind of the first one that really kind of indicated maybe a before and after within the Trump administration's Trump specifically, and a hardening stance. And there is this concern, I think, inside of Russia, the economic impact of this war. I think they do rely on the war specifically to kind of continue at least some momentum of economic growth. They need this overspending on the military and the defense budget to really have any aspects of economic growth. but I wouldn't necessarily discount the crisis within the fuel lines. And I think the fundamental difference, I I hear the argument that the Russian media is putting this as an existential war. I just believe that within Russian society, they can hear that, but they don't see it. And the strikes on certain Ukrainian civilian targets can harden resolve. But I'm wondering if the economic aspect, and specifically the fuel crisis, can have an impact within Russian society in the support of this war. Obviously, President Putin does have a very strong hold inside of Russia. We haven't really seen any serious opposition attempt to challenge this. The anti-war movement has long been gutted and killed inside of Russia. But I mean, I think this is a significant problem for the Russian state. And I think it highlights, I think, a shift within within Ukraine's calculus. And we talked about this in a space, which I heard this famous quote, somebody on another space I was talking to, he said, he's an expert in oil markets. And what this commentator mentioned was these Ukrainian strikes on the Russian oil refineries are having much more impact than any sanctions the United States or Europe can impose on the Russian economy. And I think Ukraine realizes that, and they're pressuring that to the fullest extent. It would be interesting to see with the introductions, let's say, if Tomahawk cruise missiles are given, if we see U.S. ATACMS strikes and other strikes inside of Russia, what kind of targets would the Ukrainian military do? Would they continue to focus on Russian oil refineries? Would they broaden it into other military infrastructure and targets? I think that's kind of an unknown, but I do believe that that's a concern. And so, Shane, let me ask this to you as somebody who has experience. Go ahead, Christian.
I would like to just jump in on your point, Stefano, before you move into that, just in regards to how this affects Russia. I'm very pushed back a lot regarding that. And that's partially due because I look at the entire world, not just Russia, when I look at geopolitical issues, especially recruiting for armed forces and such. Whenever there is an economic downturn, recruitment numbers across every armed force of the entire world increases. I mean, in 2008, for example, which the 2008 financial crisis is equivalent to what Russia is probably experiencing right now within their own borders. The United States recruitment numbers went from 5% to 10% between 2007 and 2009. So again, that's doubling of the U.S. recruitment numbers, and that was in a war that had zero interest in the United States, had zero backing from the general public at the time. So I think to highlight, the worse the economy gets, at least in my opinion, the more agitated the population will get and the more willing they are to fight. I mean, look at the protests that happened in 2020 in the United States, for example, and across the world. When people have financial hardship or having tough times, or the uncertainty is not there, they have more to lose. And if they have more to lose, they're more willing to pick up a rifle and go and fight. And that's just a personal perspective that I share. Like, I've definitely been in places where things have been tight in my own personal life, and like looking at the military as an option became more of a highlight for me because it's a stable job. Again, Russia has been very clear. I mean, even before this war, when I was doing work in the Ukrainian government, it was in regards to casualty numbers within Russia, and how that can be affected into the population groups that are within Russia. And what we found was, and not very obviously, usually the best analysis in the world is typically the easiest pictures to paint or pictures that don't even have to be painted, that you just walk up on. And then this is one for us of like, Russia's doing an incredibly good job of hiding the true casualty numbers within the Ukraine war to the Russian population. So when they were going to these recruitment drives across all of Russia, the people that are subscribing to that war are so indoctrinated with the idea that, yeah, I haven't seen my brother, I haven't seen my father, I haven't seen my uncle in 3 years at this point, but he's still on the front lines fighting. These people aren't aware that the war is as bad as it is until they're already on the front lines. So when you add financial hardships to them, they're only going to be more further embroiled to the idea of, hey, like, I'm going to go fight this war. our armed forces. Like there's still a level of patriotism, especially when things get bad, where the infighting starts to end, if that makes sense. You usually will have like two large political factions rise up from any financial crisis. You'll have the people that want to look internally and the people that want to look externally. And typically speaking, the people that look externally are typically the victors in any regard for any country. This isn't just Russia, this isn't just the US. What we're going to see, at least from my perspective, is a dramatic rise in militarization across Russia because A, it's the only thing keeping their economy afloat, but also B, it's the only keeping their civilization from just complete collapse. And if we've seen anything, like the Russians can survive deep hardships before they start to break.
No, and I think that's an excellent point, and we have seen that, and we have seen the recruiting numbers kind of follow through, and I think that that's 100% an excellent observation and a concern when these strikes happening. And I think that kind of goes to my follow-on question to Shane, as somebody who you and I have both done collection, we've been in targeting working cells, et cetera. From your perspective, then, with what Christian said, do you believe kind of these strikes on economic infrastructure within Russia is worthy? Is it something other that you would focus on if you were in the Ukrainian targeting working cell? What would you be looking at? What would you be collecting on? What would you be targeting on? Economic, military? Lay it out for us, Shane.
Ooh, so we're going Precipice scope here.
Let's do it.
So I mean, one thing we have to take into account is the US perspective and authorization for strikes, right? If it was just Ukraine doing strikes, I wouldn't suggest economic strikes. I would, I'd be focused on taking out HVTs and deeper command centers. However, given the fact that the US says since we started enabling longer range strikes, and if Tomahawks come in, essentially said, hey, we have to green light these. Um, I think the target almost has to be economic. But I think the current scale of the strikes are currently not enough to have that much of an impact. I think to actually have a qualitative result, you would have to see a much more broad, fully encompassing, almost shock and awe against Russian um oil oil facilities. But then the concern, like Christian highlighted, is what does that do to the population and what happens socially from that. And then there's the whole risk calculus that has to occur at that point on whether or not this is something that's actually a good idea or not. I would argue, quite frankly, it would be pushing the Russian population much closer to being willing to go more offensive and maybe focus outside of Ukraine. If, let's say Ukraine does um, um this is a notional world, okay? A notional world in which Ukraine gets longer reach capabilities and they have Tomahawks, etc. If they did a large campaign against Russian oil facilities, I think we would almost assuredly see a Russian response, in some regard. Whether that be pushing NATO's eastern flank more with drone incursions, like Poland, and seeing if NATO does anything, or something along those lines. I think that, to mitigate that risk calculus, what would have to happen would be the strikes would have to be very deliberate, but also spread out. It would have to be over a period of weeks or months. And they would have to be very, very strategically planned out. So you're hitting like main oil facilities, then, like a week or so later, you're hitting the reserve facilities, etc. I feel like that's how it would have to be done to try to mitigate some of that public blowback from it. But even then, the risk calculus is really high from the perspective that Christian brought forward. It really just goes into the realm of what is the US willing to do and what is NATO willing to do as a whole? And are we willing to accept the risk of potential spill out if we do a large scale campaign targeting the economic sectors within Russia.
I think those are the conversations currently going on. If I could just say one thing, though, I think if when targeting about high value targets, I'm just going to say this: if I'm in, I would not want to target Gerasimov simply because the lead general, basically the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff of the Russian military, simply because Gerasimov is the most incompetent military leader, I think, in the 21st century. He has demonstrated time and time again that and it's funny because when you look at Gerasimov's kind of history as a military commander, people kind of hailed him as this military genius because of the famous Gerasimov doctrine, the hybrid warfare, but at the execution of the Russian invasion into Ukraine, it has just been incompetence after incompetence after incompetence after incompetence. And I think it's kind of interesting where Russian military bloggers have highlighted the failures of Gerasimov, but Putin keeps him there, I think, simply because of loyalty more than military effectiveness. Because I think you see the situation with Wagner and Prigozhin, that for Putin, clearly the Russian society has a tolerance for high casualties, even though it's hidden. There are funerals, there are memorials, there are a lot of things for the Russian military that we've seen. There's a great account on X called Russian Officers Killed in Ukraine that documents this, all based on Russian social media, news article, memorials, highlighting how there's been memorials for Russia's casualties during the Soviet Union invasions in Afghanistan, and how just recently for the Ukraine one, you see these memorials double, triple, quadruple, or even 10 times fold the casualties that the Russian Soviets suffered during Afghanistan. And so I think some of that has been baked in. I think the full scope of it, I would agree with Christian and Shane, that it hasn't necessarily been, absolutely absorbed. But I think Putin values Gerasimov because of the loyalty, because he is concerned of a repeat of Prigozhin. And I think that is a fundamental issue, and that is a fundamental problem. I understand the argument from the economic sense, and there are ways that it can be analyzed. However, we have seen Russian in this history where economic problems cause Russia to reduce its military footprint and expansion. We've seen that during the Cold War. The Russian Imperial Army during World War I is another perfect case in point. And I think those are kind of the things of some of the areas of this kind of Ukraine strikes, because I think there is historical precedence where there might be a breaking point. The question is how far along is that breaking point, and within the cohesion of the Russian military. But Christian and Shane, as you guys alluded to, there are kind of the question is, how far is Europe and the United States willing to go? And we've seen interesting reporting on this. On, I believe it was the reports on the hospitals to be prepared for, a major war. Germany estimates of, I think, over 1,000 casualties a day in a case of war with Europe. We've seen, I think, Political Today reported that the sentiment within higher European diplomatic circles is that we're in like this pre-World War I era of increased tensions, and everybody's waiting for the Franz Ferdinand moment that triggered World War I happening here now, and this concern of World War III. So, Christian, I mean, we are seeing at least European sentiment, at least at the diplomatic side, changing. There are concerns, certain preparations. What are you saying, Christian?
I think World War III started in 2022 when Russia decided to invade Ukraine, and not because Russia invaded Ukraine that World War III started, but because the West actually did what they said they were going to do and provided resolve. I think that's the same thing with World War II, for example. Germany and Russia invade Poland, but it isn't necessarily the initial invasion of that country so much as it is the resistance that's created once those invasions actually begun. I think the rhetoric change right now is it provides a very stark picture, and I've always been a proponent of watching what leaders do, not what they say. As you brought up, Stefano, which is insane across the board, is yeah, French, German leaders are calling basically to increase their hospital capacities. And they're not doing this over the course of like, let's say 2030. Because like if you were to look at, and I'm going to switch the topic really quickly, but if you look at like the Indo-Pacific, for example, like when US leaders talk to the Philippines, for example, they're like, you need to increase your hospital footprint to be able to handle mass casualty events for when Taiwan's invaded or whatever the situation is. People are like, oh yeah, that's going to happen, but the timeline's 2032 and 2028 for this, and it's just like it like paints this picture of like, okay, there is a risk here, but it's not like an imminent risk. The French and German governments have switched their stances so they can have hospital capacities completely upped to be able to support thousands of casualties every week by 2026. We are in September. It is September 29th as we record this episode. So they have effectively 2 months to increase their hospital capacity for the appeasement of their governments across the board to be able to sustain frontal conflict with a near peer adversary, i.e., Russia. That doesn't cover even the beginning of it. I mean, you have countless, whether it's Finland, whether it's Sweden. Estonia this morning came out and said that they need to basically turn back the clock and reopen a lot of Cold War shelter facilities that were basically have just been kind of underutilized and not used since the fall of the Berlin Wall. We are in, and I know I mentioned it before, of like the Trump retaliation, like changing of rhetoric and stuff, but like I fully believe that in this moment, as we stand, we are in the beginnings of the escalations of like when the UK decided to retaliate against Germany, retaliate against Russia during World War II. Like I feel like we are like literally on the precipice of that. Stefano, your point of like World War I, waiting for Archduke Ferdinand to be assassinated, like that moment, I feel like we are in that right now. And Russia's probing to see what that will be. Is it going to be a drone incursion? Is it going to be flying fighter jets over the Estonian airspace and NATO fighter jets fire at them and take them down? Like we are literally living through that. It's been a prolonged cycle. I know I said it on, I think it was the last episode or the episode before that we talked about the European crisis, but I discussed it and I said it like, if you had asked me in 2008, 2009, what would happen if Russia flew fighter jets over Estonia and started basically peppering Poland with drones, what the NATO reaction and response would be, and it would be destroying those facilities. And like volley one is returned with volley two. But I mean, we're seeing that, but we're seeing it in like in a very strategic. And again, it's like as analysts, we always get pissed off because it's like, okay, we learn all of these things. Like if A happens, B happens next. If C happens, D happens next. And we're seeing that play out, but we're seeing it play out in like a very prolonged, elongated scenario of like, okay, volley happens here. We're going to wait a couple weeks and then volley two will happen here. It's like kind of what we're seeing. As analysts, we always were under the impression that if a strike happened here, a strike would happen here within 48 hours or whatever. I mean, we're seeing that, but we're seeing it in kind of like a spread out manner, which is causing some frustration amongst the analysts because they're like, NATO doesn't do anything. The West doesn't do anything. But it's like, yeah, we are doing stuff. It's just taking a while. If you look from like a military planning perspective, I know, Shane, that you were in ForceCom, like that is the United States reactionary force, but it's still going to take 48 hours for us to deploy anywhere in the world. Like that just needs to be like subjugated to the general populace that might not be privy to these things. That stuff takes time. And where we're sitting right now is we have Russia continuing to climb the escalation ladder. The West is also climbing the escalation ladder, but I would start to believe that it's happening in more of a covert level and not an overt level. Russia doesn't care if Polish citizens find out that they're dropping drones on their territory. We care for the optics of our nation if we're, for example, last night shuttling God knows how many F-16s, F-35s, F-22s from the West to Europe. So all of these things and moving, obviously, the refueling aircrafts and just basically prepping ourselves for the inevitable war that we see is on the horizon. And to your point, Stefano, like MI5, former head of MI5 for the UK this morning came out and said, we are in World War III. Prime Minister Tusk of Poland came out and basically said that we are at a war with Russia. If you listen to any of the UN speeches, any of that stuff, it is very clear that the Russians obviously believe in the narrative that they're at war with NATO. They've been saying this since first months of 2022, when the United States and NATO allies and European allies, as well as Australia and Canadian, etc., all started to pour in support for Ukraine. We're starting to see that rhetoric change from the West's perspective towards the Russian perspective of, yeah, we are at war. What that means for the general populace of the world is obviously a very dangerous place. I have believed that World War III has been in fruition. I don't think World War III is going to be fought like World War II, at least at the front stages of it. I think that will change in the next few months. I believe that there will be some sort of U.S. strikes against Russia in some capacity, whether it's within Ukraine or even in the Russian border, or even a retaliatory Polish Patriot missile firing and taking out an Su-34, or whatever the story is. There will be kinetic response between NATO infantry and Russian infantry, or NATO airmen versus Russian airmen. There will be some sort of human-to-human conflict at this point. We've already crossed the giant red line that was in the sand that Russian equipment will not be destroyed by U.S. equipment, etc. However you want to paint that picture. We've already done that. We've already done that in this war. We've already done that in the last month when we shot down drones over Poland. I will yield my space, give you, Shane, the opportunity to speak on this. But to answer your question, Stefano, we are in, I would believe, the cataclysmic downfall of the Western order as we see it right now. Because what will happen when this war kicks off is we will see a massive exodus in the financial markets. There will be uneasiness across the entire board. I don't believe that we're going to be seeing like a Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 Russian invasion of fucking the east coast of the US, but there will be kinetic strikes against European targets, and there will be US strikes against Russian targets.
One thing I want to highlight also, everyone thinks things will happen really fast, and all of a sudden, the US will be at war and we'll be, going crazy doing stuff. One thing we have to take into account is the amount of dependents that are currently in Europe of US service members and also non-combatants. No one has talked about that really. And I can tell you from personal experience and doing planning and IPB for other theaters, one of the big things that has to be taken into account is NEO for non-combatants. Just looking at Germany, for example, there's roughly 50,000 dependents of U.S. service members in Germany. If something was to spill over and happen, not only do you have the kinetic side going on, but you also have to transport all those non-combatants out of theater. And I personally believe if we were to get to the point that this becomes a traditional kinetic war in that aspect of, U.S. versus Russia, what we will see happening leading up to shaping efforts will be a massive NEO happening, moving dependence of service members. I think that's a major indicator that lots of people aren't talking about, but should be looking for coming up over the next year or so.
I think it would be an interesting, framework. And clearly, I think it's just a very interesting timeline that we live in, and the kind of the significant shift we've seen in the Trump administration. But I think it does show that Russia continues, no matter what happens in the maximalist demands. And that's kind of why we're seeing these kind of a significant increase in tensions. We have seen at least the Europeans, we would love them to be a little bit quicker, but slowly start picking up not only the rhetoric, but some of the military aspect as well. And so I think that is the question that is going on is, at some point, is there a position where Russia, is kind of this escalation to de-escalate, right? And then how does that kind of look like and what's going on? And if that's the next steps that's going to occur, But the U.S. military, I think the tanker deployments right now, that's all we're seeing, right? This isn't, when for example, when we were analyzing Israel and Iran, and when U.S. strikes against Iran, there was significantly much more military deployments there. Um, right now, President Trump months ago did highlight, oh, we're deploying nuclear submarines off the Russian coast, kind of as a response to the kind of Medvedev's, threats on Twitter or X. And now we just kind of seen the tankers. I haven't necessarily seen a significant, much more deployments, at least on the U.S. military side, to indicate that they believe that a military conflict is imminent. I think, Shane, you absolutely highlighted the NEOs and some of these dependents and kind of trying to evacuate them. We would probably see a lot more statements coming from U.S. embassies based out of Eastern Europe, or even Europe as a whole, the State Department specifically. By law, they have to warn American citizens of that. And that's generally one of the indicators that we get when conflict is imminent, is always look at the U.S. State Department and the embassy statements. So I think we haven't really breached that yet. The question, obviously, I think this is an if or a when conversation. But obviously, the rhetoric has changed. The tensions are rising. It's interesting that, and I go back to this conversation originally, is like, President Putin's best chance for any type of favorable peace treaty was with President Trump and Steve Witkoff. It's interesting to see that Steve Witkoff has taken a back seat, it looks like, in a lot of the negotiations. But I think he's probably been much more focused now in Israel, Gaza, and completely relegated Russia, Ukraine. We are seeing General Kellogg, who's been much more pro-Ukraine in his stance, take a much more, front seat row. He's been much more involved in having conversations with our European allies, with Ukraine. And I think that's kind of the shift in rhetoric that we're seeing. But the things that I'm looking for is, one, do we see any other military deployments into Europe, regardless of the national defense strategy? I tell people, the national defense strategy is only relevant if everything is normal. When crisis happens, the U.S. military responds. So do we see more military deployments outside of tankers? Some of these will probably not be announced. Some of them might be announced. So that's number one. And then the other areas, obviously, is the State Department. That's the key aspect, and any indications to what you alluded to, Shane, is kind of these NEOs or precautions for U.S. citizens based in Europe or Eastern Europe, specifically the Baltic countries. Those are the ones that I would be looking at very much so. And that would probably be a clear indication. The Zapad exercise obviously concluded, nothing really significant within that construct. We are Peskov said, and this is like the 50 millionth time we've heard this, that President Putin has a significant announcement to make this week. We've seen that repeated happen over and over again. Nothing really major happens. We will keep an eye on that to see if this is kind of something significantly different. We also got a report. The Kremlin really hasn't, and the press secretary Peskov hasn't really commented really on the statements from President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance related to the Tomahawk cruise missiles possibly going to Ukraine. They're being kind of tempered in their response to that. We haven't seen any real bellicose response yet. It would be interesting. The one, if we see it, will probably come from Medvedev. And we've known President Trump has no issues answering him directly on Truth Social. But again, there is a clear shift. I think the negotiations are done. They're not going anywhere anytime soon. We'll see if that ever picks up, and the situation on the ground might change. But those are the areas that at least Russian media and the Kremlin taking a step back right now. But Christian, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to jump in real quick to I think, yes, I do think that there will be a lot of U.S. Specific rhetoric before an inevitable U.S. clash with Russia. I think that's almost a certainty at this point. But I would just like to highlight that NATO is comprised of more countries than just the U.S. and Russia. I mean, the rhetoric coming out of Poland, the rhetoric coming out of Denmark, etc., is all very hawkish at the moment. I mean, France, Germany, etc., UK, this morning, like we discussed. I think that we need to realize that, yes, the United States is unequivocally the leader of NATO, per se. The U.S. is also pretty stretched thin with pretty much a front on every continent at this moment, besides Antarctica. I know that things are kind of shifting in Africa, etc. But like, I mean, we potentially might invade Venezuela or at least start more kinetic strikes against Venezuela and cartel states. We have Indo-PACOM. We're not gonna back out of obviously CENTCOM is always busy. I don't think that we will see like a mass infill of forces from the US side to Europe if things were to kick off. I think that would be in stages. I think the Europeans would be, at least from under the Trump administration, and based on the rhetoric he has said in the past, the Europeans would bear at least the initial brunt of any sort of uh, Russia Russia NATO clash. Correct me if I'm wrong, Shane. I mean, that's more your alley, but at least that's my opinion of it. I think the tanker deployments do paint a very stark image that, yeah, maybe it is time to follow our European leaders and claim that we're at war. I know Trump's obviously his actions have completely shifted. I mean, we're on the precipice of giving Ukraine some of our most advanced non-classified weaponry. So I think we're right there. Um, and yeah, I mean, if a horse is brown, is it brown in the picture? Probably. I mean, it's kind of where we're at. Like if everybody's claiming that we're at war, what is the next volley? Um, Putin, from just a strategic perspective, has always enjoyed rhetoric more than the actual conflict itself. However, he can paint a narrative, he will. I mean, before his time as a politician, he was KGB, FSB, etc. Um, Everybody that knows intelligence services, especially human intelligence services, know that narratives are the most important picture. And if there is narratives that NATO is coming out claiming that they're at war with Russia, it helps his own resolve amongst A, his leadership, B, his populace, and he's able to push those agendas that he has faster and more aggressively than he otherwise would have been able to. Um, and again, that is escalation ladder theory in a nutshell, right? If we're going to come out here and say that we're at war, we need to actually back those statements up with real action, real decisive action, whether that is giving Ukraine the arms that they need, or even just like subsequently assisting them with more intelligence capabilities, military planning, etc. Or how I would like to see it, we actually do what we say we're going to do on paper, and we start bombing the facilities that are being used to cause drone incursions into NATO. If you want my full, unadulterated, like completely notional military retaliation for what's happened in Russia, it would be to fly some fifth generation fighters over Kaliningrad, take out a military installation or two, and just cause, as you say, Stefano, the escalation to de-escalate tactics. I think the lack of decision-making capabilities on the West part and kind of our freeze to do anything is a weakness in the eyes of Russia. Whether it's a weakness from a geopolitical perspective as a whole, I don't believe so. I know I just highlighted that with my ramblings, but I think the kind of the stalemate aspect of where we're at is kind of the better one, to not go up that ladder as quickly and kind of slow the Russians down, because I think they are again looking for that World War I-esque loaded gun in order to hand themselves to justify a larger conflict. Um, the day that NATO kills a Russian service member, I think is the day that Putin decides to take the gloves off and call up national mobilization and actually try to do something. Whether that's logistically possible on their front, I know we'll argue back and forth, Stefano. I think that they can still hold their weight for like actual infantry combat from a perspective of there's no air power. But if air power is obviously in play, which it will be, I think that we absolutely mop the fucking floor with the Russians and we push everything back into Moscow. But if we are looking from a more strategic landscape, does Russia do things that would be considered unthinkable to the West? I mean, Russia still hasn't even conducted a public nuclear deterrence-esque exercise. I mean, obviously they used the MIRV, which shook the spines of every analyst in the Western world, they could still detonate a nuclear weapon over the Black Sea, and I think that would cause confusion and operational fatigue across all of NATO. I don't believe at that moment the West will respond. Under the Biden administration, I believe we would have responded. Under the Trump administration, I think we throw our hands up and we don't do anything.
So I understand that, but I did because of the kind of the MERV construct that the ballistic missiles that the Russians highlighted as this hypersonic super duper ballistic like because I agree with you, a lot of analysts were shocked. I was like, well, why are you shocked? I mean, MERV technology has existed for decades. It's nothing necessarily new. And I think that kind of goes back to my original point that I think again we continuously fall in this kind of this construct within yes, there's a threat, but it's nothing necessarily significant. The ballistic missile specifically, the technology that it used is nothing new. They call it a hypersonic. It's not. Yes, every ballistic missile is hypersonic since the invention of ballistic missiles. For the most part, they all travel at hypersonic speeds. And then the MERV, again, nothing necessarily new. Just has multiple warheads instead of just one. There are other systems that exist, like the early release submunitions. Again, a lot of those capabilities have existed. And I think my fundamental issue within the construct of this conversation is there's a threat, and then there's the overestimation of the threat. And if President Putin was interested in conducting an attack against NATO, I don't necessarily believe he needs a justification within his own society to do it. I think the framing of if you look at the framing of the conflict right now in Russian information space, both inside of Russia and even those in the West that peddle Russian misinformation, the framing is basically Russia is already fighting NATO in Ukraine. That's the framing. And even the arguments are, there's been thousands of NATO soldiers killed in Ukraine. They're just wearing a Ukrainian uniform, but not NATO. And the war in Ukraine is already degrading the NATO militaries. I mean, and that's kind of the construct of the framing of the conflict already inside of Russia and within Western analysts. I mean, how often do we see these absolutely terrible posts indicating a Polish general died in Ukraine, right? And so, again, I think a lot of that framing already exists inside of Russia. If Putin wanted to expand the conflict, I don't think he needs a justification. He could just do it. I've been the argument. I think there is some delusion within the Russian military infrastructure and the political leadership. But I think there's still that reality that NATO might be a step too far. But how far can we push NATO's, defense as far as possible without triggering Article 5? But having said that, I do want to thank Christian and Shane for joining us for this amazing conversation. Again, we talk about Russia, Ukraine, and the United States as we've had many, many times, either in spaces and podcasts. And this clearly is going to be a recurring theme in a lot of the conversations we have. So with that, I want to thank you all for listening with this episode. This has been a Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast.